Maybe you need someone to show you how the vending machine works. Clarke, I know community college didn't cover advanced button pushing. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before his entire world collapsed. He didn't know he was standing 3 feet away from a Navy Cross recipient. He had no idea that the woman folding her hands calmly at her sides had carried a bleeding Admiral through 3 miles of enemy fire in Helmand Province while taking rounds that should have killed her twice. The whispers in the hallway called her incompetent. They called her a fraud. They didn't know she was the reason 17 combat personnel came home alive. St. Michael's ICU in Portland hums under fluorescent lights that turn everything the color of old bone. Monitors beep in steady rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that fills the silence between shifts. The smell of antiseptic clings to every surface, sharp and chemical, underneath the fainter scent of rain bleeding through the ventilation system from the parking lot outside. Hannah Clarke stands at bed 7 with her hand steady as surgical steel, adjusting the foredrip with movements so precise they look rehearsed. No hesitation. No tremor. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The Admiral in the bed watches her with polite, empty confusion. His stroke took his memory 3 weeks ago, erased the past like someone clearing a whiteboard. His forearm bears a faded tattoo, Clarke, in military block letters, the ink nearly colorless from 18 years of sun and time. She knows what it means. She knows exactly when he had it done, which port bar in Naples, which tattoo artist with shaking hands and a morphine problem who still got the letters perfect. But his eyes slide past her face without recognition, just another nurse among dozens. She wears long sleeves even in the heat of summer, even when the ICU temperature climbs above 72 degrees. The scars mapping her forearms tell stories nobody here is cleared to hear, shrapnel from Jalabad, blade work from Kandahar, burns from a compound that went hot in the dark. She pulls the sleeves down whenever someone enters the room. The scar tissue forms patterns like topography, mountains, and valleys that would raise questions she cannot answer. Her locker is in the back hallway where the light flickers every 8 seconds. Inside, beneath her spare stethoscope and the granola bar she never eats, wrapped in a surgical glove and hidden behind a textbook nobody has opened since 2019, sits a tarnished military challenge coin. The edges are worn smooth from hands that held it through insomnia and rain and the kind of silence that comes after people die. She touches it once per shift, just a contact, just confirmation. The coin weighs less than an ounce but carries more than she can name. She touches it this morning at 0617 hours, 23 minutes before rounds begin, and the metal is cold even though her hand is warm. Dr. Whitfield arrives at 0641 precisely, trailing residents like ducklings in formation. He wears a tie that costs more than her rent, navy silk with a subtle gold pattern that probably has a name and a story about his family money. His eyes are the kind of cold that comes from being accustomed to winning. He's been building his case for exactly 3 weeks, ever since Hannah questioned the equipment order that crossed her desk during the inventory audit. $40,000 for sterile gauze packaging equipment from a supplier nobody had used before. The company name was MedTech Solutions. The owner was Richard Whitfield. The brother. She had been quiet about it. She had asked the right questions in the right channels, filled out the correct forms, let the protocol move at its own institutional speed. But Dr. Whitfield's phone had rung 40 minutes after her inquiry went through the system, and his brother had called to warn him, and Dr. Whitfield had decided that Hannah Clarke needed to understand her place. Morning rounds, he announces to the residents, his voice calibrated to carry. Hannah is 2 beds away, checking the dressing on a post-op thoracotomy patient. She doesn't turn. We need to discuss proper ICU protocol and the importance of respecting scope of practice limitations. His words are careful. His tone is a knife. The residents shuffle closer. They're young, PGY2 and PGY03, the hierarchy still fresh in their minds, the fear of being wrong still strong enough to keep them obedient. One of them is a woman named Dr. Patel who actually knows how to read an echo and admitted last week that she uses Hannah's hemodynamic assessments to cross-check her own numbers. Dr. Patel stops walking. Her jaw tightens. Some staff members, Whitfield continues, moving toward the Admiral's bed with the fluid confidence of a man who has never been told no, seem to believe their community college education qualifies them for decision-making roles. His eyes find Hannah. He holds the contact for 4 seconds too long. We're fortunate that rigorous medical training exists to prevent such errors from reaching the bedside. Hannah finishes securing the dressing. The tape clicks softly against skin. Her face is a mask, not anger, not hurt, nothing that could be weaponized. She has had 23 years of practice at this expression. She has worn it through situations that would make most people scream. In fact, Whitfield adds, turning now to face the gathered group, his voice louder, I think we should all remind ourselves of the fundamental hierarchies that keep patients safe. He pauses. He's enjoying this. The kind of man who gets pleasure from the precise moment before he delivers the humiliation. Perhaps some of our colleagues could benefit from a basic skills refresher. Communication is key. For instance, many of our less experienced staff struggle with something as simple as a vending machine interaction. The buttons are quite sophisticated. He smiles. It's a smile with teeth. Perhaps someone should volunteer to provide instruction. The hallway is quiet except for the steady electronic beeping of the monitors. Rubber gloves snap somewhere down the corridor, someone prepping equipment, completely unaware that a man is sharpening his cruelty against a woman who will never flinch. Hannah looks at him with eyes that have seen things most humans only experience in nightmares. She says nothing. She simply turns back to her patient and begins checking the peripheral line, her movements precise, methodical, unbroken. Clarke, I'm speaking to you. It's not a request. It's not even really a question. I heard you, doctor. 7 words. Her voice is steady as a floor. Deferential but not weak, there's steel underneath it, so carefully buried that only someone with experience would hear it. Thank you for the guidance. One of the residents breathes quietly. Dr. Patel's hands have formed fists. Whitfield's face tightens just slightly. He doesn't enjoy being dismissed this efficiently. I trust you understand that if you can't keep up with the basic requirements of protocol, we may need to arrange for security to escort you from the unit during your shifts. For patient safety, of course. I understand, doctor. Do you? He takes a step closer. This is the moment where he expects a reaction. Trembling. Eyes filling. Some break in the mask. Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you might need a little extra supervision. Make sure you don't accidentally practice medicine without a license. He turns to the residents with a laugh that sounds like a car engine starting. Wouldn't want that, would we? Hannah adjusts the saline drip. O2 sat reading 78. Acceptable. She makes a note in the chart. Her hand doesn't shake. The pen doesn't waver. She is a surgical instrument made of bone and certainty and the kind of focus that comes from having to perform medical procedures in the dark with only the sound of an admiral's breathing to guide you. All right everyone, Whitfield says, already turning away, already moving on to the next bed, already planning the next angle of attack because this one didn't land the way he wanted. Let's review the Adams chart. Post-op day 3, and I'm concerned about his drain output. Hannah stops listening. She moves to the Admiral's bedside instead. He's awake, eyes tracking the ceiling fan that rotates in slow circles above him. When she enters his field of vision, his face doesn't change. There's no recognition, no spark of the man who held her hand while a medevac helicopter approached through the dust storm. She bends slightly to check his dressing, and her forearm passes within 6 inches of his tattooed arm. The faded letters, Clarke. Her own name, inked into his skin, a ghost of something that used to mean the difference between living and dying. She pauses for exactly 1 breath. Then she straightens and returns to documenting vitals with the same mechanical precision. The chart is filled with numbers: blood pressure 137/84, heart rate 62, respiratory rate 14, O2 sat 98 on 2 liters. Everything normal. Everything within the acceptable range for a stroke patient with multi-system involvement. The Admiral will need a second CT tomorrow. She notes this. She will probably be the one to call transport. She will probably hold his hand in the elevator, even though he won't remember her name. Even though the world has decided she never earned the right to have a name at all. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came later, during her lunch break, when she opened her locker and found the coin sitting on top of her clean scrubs, no longer wrapped in the surgical glove, left exposed where anyone could have found it. The tarnished metal gleamed under the flickering hallway light. The edges caught the illumination and threw it back like a tiny mirror. She picked it up with 2 fingers, careful, as if it might be contaminated. The challenge coin is brass over steel, stamped with an anchor on one side and the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Group 2 on the other. On the face, Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. On the reverse, Freedom Isn't Free. Her name. Her actual name. The one that doesn't exist in any database that matters anymore. Someone had been in her locker. Someone had found it. Someone knew. She closes her hand around the coin, and the metal is so cold it burns. Her breath stays even. Her face stays blank. She slides the coin back into her pocket and closes the locker door with a soft metallic click. When she returns to the unit at 1247 hours, she's already planning how to move the coin to a safer location. Not at work. Somewhere private. Somewhere that doesn't exist in institutional memory. She passes Dr. Whitfield in the hallway. He glances at her, and there's something different in his expression, a satisfaction that wasn't there this morning. His eyes track her for half a second too long. He knows. Or he suspects. Or his brother has called with information about some background check that turned up classified records that can't be fully classified because they technically never happened. Hannah keeps walking. Her pace doesn't change. Her expression doesn't shift. She is already 7 steps past him when his phone rings, and she hears him answer with his voice pitched higher, excitement crackling through it like electricity. Yes, I'll hold for the board administrator. Tell them I have something urgent regarding one of our ICU staff members. A scope of practice violation that requires immediate attention. The fluorescent lights continue their mechanical hum. The monitors continue their beeping. The rain continues falling in Portland, drumming against the windows like applause for a show that hasn't finished yet. But something has shifted in the air pressure. Something has changed. The shift change bell chimed at 7 in the morning, and Dr. Whitfield had already assembled his audience. 20 medical students crowded into the conference room on the 3rd floor of St. Michael's, their white coats still crisp, their eyes still hungry for the wisdom of a tenured physician. Hannah Clarke stood against the back wall, arms crossed, listening to the fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects trapped in glass. Whitfield dimmed the lights. A screen flickered to life. Her charting appeared, 24 hours of vitals documentation, each entry time to the minute, each measurement precise. Her handwriting filled the slide, neat and methodical, the work of someone who had kept soldiers alive in the dark. Here, Whitfield said, his voice pitched for the students, we see what happens when we lower our hiring standards. Nurse Clarke, Community College, correct, has documented vitals in a format that might confuse those of us with actual medical degrees. He tapped the pointer against the screen. One of the students snickered. 2 others exchanged a look that needed no translation. Notice the inconsistency in her abbreviation usage. Notice how she's failed to cross-reference the medication administration against the chart. This is what happens when we hire based on diversity quotas rather than rigor. Hannah's jaw clenched. 1 millimeter. That was all. Her eyes didn't move. She watched him point at her work the way a general might point at a map of occupied territory, claiming dominion over something that had already been won 1,000 times over. The challenge coin in her locker was burning at the back of her mind, but she pushed it down. Compartmentalize. Lock it. Move forward. Whitfield turned to face the students, his expression mild. Clarke, would you care to explain your documentation philosophy to our residents? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence that followed was the kind that comes from absolute certainty, the kind she'd learned in extraction operations when every second of hesitation meant someone didn't come home. The students shifted in their seats. Whitfield's smile tightened. "Thank you for that illuminating contribution," he said. "That will be all." She was already gone. The break room smelled like stale coffee and microwave tuna from someone's lunch rotation. Hannah stood at the coffee maker, filling her mug with the mechanical focus of someone performing a task, not experiencing a moment. The afternoon shift had left the pot nearly empty, and she stood waiting for the last few drops to drip through the filter, her eyes fixed on the steady stream of dark liquid. The door opened. She didn't turn. Whitfield entered with the posture of a man who owned the room. For other residents trailed behind him, the ones who had smirked during grand rounds, the ones whose careers he could make or break with a single word in a letter of recommendation. He spotted her immediately and moved toward the coffee maker with deliberate slowness. "Clarke," he said, his voice bright and patronizing. "Quick question, do you need help operating this machine? I know the buttons can be tricky. We could get security to give you a tutorial. Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself." The room went still. A resident laughed, a sharp, ugly sound, like glass breaking in a sink. The others joined in, a chorus of mockery that filled the space like humidity before a storm. Hannah's hand wrapped around the handle of her mug. Her grip didn't tighten. Her breathing didn't change. She poured her coffee into the cup with the same steady precision she used to hold and fall line during shock, and she walked toward the door. "Working the vending machine next shift," Whitfield called after her. "You might want to practice." More laughter. She walked through the doorway without acknowledging any of it. The door swung closed behind her with a whisper of air, and the voices continued in the room she had left. That was the thing about composure, it never gave them the satisfaction. Her jaw ached by the time she reached the stairwell, but her face was a mask. The ICU bay at 3 o'clock held 6 patients, all of them steady, all of them monitored by machines that beeped in a mechanical rhythm like the pulse of the hospital itself. Hannah moved through her rounds with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for years, not just the 8 years since she'd started nursing, but the 12 years before that, when her hands had learned to work in darkness and sand and blood. She documented vitals on the Admiral in bed 7, the old man with her name tattooed on his forearm in faded blue ink, the letters spelling Clarke in a font that belonged to another lifetime entirely. The shift change report was coming due. Hannah stood at the nurse's station, her documentation complete, every number recorded, every observation noted. Whitfield materialized beside her like smoke, his white coat still immaculate, his expression the kind of pleasant that preceded cruelty. "Clarke," he said quietly, so the patients wouldn't hear. "If you can't keep up with protocol, if you're going to continue embarrassing this department with your substandard work, I'll have security escort you out myself. This is a teaching hospital, not a charity operation for people playing dress-up." He paused, letting the words settle. Dollar store nurse might work in some rural clinic, but not here. Not at St. Michael's. An elderly woman 2 beds over glanced up, startled. A resident pretended to check a chart, his attention focused anywhere but the conversation. Hannah finished the entry she was writing. She didn't look at Whitfield. She didn't acknowledge the slur or the threat. She simply stood, capped her pen, and walked toward the supply closet, her movements precise, her breathing controlled. Inside the locker room, she opened her assigned compartment. The challenge coin was still there, wrapped in a surgical glove, pressed against the back corner where no one thought to look. She pulled it out and held it in her palm. The metal was cool and smooth, worn by years of hands that had squeezed it for luck, for memory, for identity. On one side, an eagle with wings spread wide. On the other, a name she no longer owned officially, a rank she no longer carried on any uniform, a unit that had been scrubbed from every database by people who needed her to disappear. Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, assigned to Joint Task Force. The coin left an impression in her palm where she held it, a deep indentation that would take hours to fade. She wrapped it in the surgical glove again and put it back in the dark corner of her locker. Then she returned to her shift, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her documentation immaculate, her composure unbroken. But something had shifted. The Admiral's monitor showed an irregular rhythm developing, nothing serious yet, just the kind of arrhythmia that sometimes came with age and stroke recovery. She noted it on the chart. The machines recorded it. The hospital systems logged it into the digital void where data went to be stored and forgotten. She was restocking the supply cart with fresh for kits when the monitor erupted into an alarm at 0200 hours. The sound cut through the quiet ICU like a siren, that awful high-pitched shriek that meant something had broken catastrophically, that time had suddenly begun counting backward instead of forward. Hannah was moving before her conscious mind caught up with her body, her hands reaching for the code button, her voice calling for the attending on duty. "Code blue, bed 7, she said into the overhead system. "Severe arrhythmia, possible cardiac tamponade. Resuscitation in progress." The attending arrived first, Dr. Chen, who pulled up the chart on the mobile station and read it in 4 seconds flat. He looked at the monitor, then at the Admiral's blood pressure, which was dropping in real time, each number smaller than the last. 60/40. 55/35. The fluid around the old man's heart was crushing it like a fist tightening. "Comfort care only," Chen said quietly. "Advanced directives, comfort measures, do not resuscitate. He's a stroke patient, multi-system failure. Intervention here is futile. We're not opening his chest. Let him go with dignity." He left. A cardiologist arrived next, called up from the second floor because protocol demanded a specialist's opinion. She read the same chart in 3 seconds, glanced at the monitor, and made her decision. Risk-benefit analysis doesn't support intervention. He's not a candidate for ECMO. The pericardiocentesis won't change his trajectory. We're looking at prolonging suffering. I can't recommend it. She left. A third doctor came, then a fourth. Each one read the chart. Each one looked at the monitor. Each one offered the same reasoning: advanced age, stroke damage, multi-system failure, liability, family wishes, comfort care, futility. The words became a mantra, a chorus line of refusal that filled the ICU bay with the sound of people walking away. Hannah watched each one arrive and depart, counting silently. 5 doctors, then 8, then 12. The Admiral's pressure continued to fall. 50/30. 45/28. The monitor began to show the first signs of electrical deterioration, the rhythm becoming increasingly chaotic, increasingly desperate. By 0218 hours, 20 doctors had refused. The chief resident was the last one. He stood at the bedside for exactly 30 seconds, read the chart, looked at the Admiral's face. The man was unconscious now, the stroke having stolen his awareness long before his heart stopped, and shook his head. "I'm calling the attending of record. We're pronouncing him in 5 minutes. No intervention. Comfort care protocol. That's the standard of care here." He was gone. The monitor showed a sustained arrhythmia that was becoming more erratic by the second. The pressure was 40/20. The Admiral had maybe 60 seconds of consciousness left at this level, and he'd lost consciousness an hour ago. Hannah stood alone in the ICU bay, just her and the machines and a man who had once carried her through 3 miles of enemy fire in Helmand Province while his own blood ran down her back, while RPGs tore through the air above them, while he refused to let her slow down even though she was carrying him and he weighed 220 pounds and his leg was nearly gone. She looked at his forearm. Clarke. The tattoo was faded now, the ink running like watercolor in some places, the letters slightly blurred by time and heat and the wear of a man's skin over decades. Her hand moved to the pericardiocentesis kit without conscious thought. The movement was so familiar it felt like someone else was making it, someone who had done this in the dark under fire, someone who had saved lives in places where there were no monitors or attending physicians, just hands, an instinct and the absolute refusal to let someone die while you still had options. She opened the kit. The needle was already attached to the syringe, a 14-gauge angiocath, sterile, ready. The technique was muscle memory from a lifetime ago: find the space between the ribs, the fifth intercostal space, the mid-axillary line. Insert the needle at a 45-degree angle, advance until you hit fluid, draw back until the resistance releases. The monitor showed 38/16. The room was silent except for the steady hiss of the ventilator and the erratic beeping of a heart that was running out of time. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for a doctor. She simply moved the sheet away from his chest, felt for the landmarks of his ribs with fingers that remembered this geography from a place that no longer officially existed, and prepared to do what 20 doctors had refused to do. The Admiral's heart was failing. The fluid around it was suffocating it. And Hannah Clarke, who had walked away from her military identity, who had accepted a new life as a nurse, who had endured humiliation without flinching and insults without response, was about to become someone else entirely. The monitor erupted at 0200 hours. One alarm became two, became a symphony of screaming, the kind of sound that turns ICU nurses' heads even through closed doors. Hannah was in Bay 7 before the second notification hit the nursing station. The Admiral's chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow gasps. Oxygen saturation 88. Then 84. His pressure had collapsed to 52/31, a number that meant the heart was drowning. Fluid. There was fluid around the heart, compressing it like a fist closing around a bird, and the bird was trying to beat its wings, but there wasn't any room left. She reached for the phone. Dialed cardiology. The resident picked up on the fourth ring, voice thick with sleep interrupted. The Admiral in Bay 7 is in cardiac tamponade. We need you now. The resident's response came measured, cautious. What's his advance directive? Hannah said nothing. Let the question sit. The resident continued, with the stroke, with the multi-system failure, I think we need to discuss goals of care. I'm not going to authorize an intervention on a patient whose quality of life is. Hannah hung up. Not unprofessionally. Just hung up and moved to the next call. Pulmonary. Critical care. Thoracic surgery. Each doctor who answered the phone heard the same request, the same clinical reality, and each one delivered a variation of the same refusal. Liability. Advance directives. Futility. The word futility kept appearing in her head, and every time it did, she thought about carrying a 220-pound man 3 miles through Helmand province while bullets split the air like angry hornets, and someone telling her the situation was futile. By the time the 20th doctor declined, the Admiral's pressure had dropped to 38/22. His heart rate was 142, wild and desperate, a rhythm like a trapped animal throwing itself against cage walls. The monitor screamed. Hannah looked at the clock, 0206. For minutes. She could feel the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders like Kevlar, heavy and familiar. 20 doctors had said no. The system had said no. Protocol said no. But the Admiral's heart was still trying to beat, and his fingers were still moving slightly on the blanket, and the machine was showing her the mathematics of failure in real time, pressure dropping 1 point every 12 seconds. She didn't ask permission. Permission was a luxury she had abandoned in Helmand province, where asking permission meant dead Marines. She opened the pericardiocentesis kit, her hands moving with the kind of precision that comes from somewhere deeper than thought. Muscle memory. The kind that lives in the joints and the nervous system, that survives a decade of civilian life and 1,000 moments of forced restraint. She cleaned the skin with betadine, the smell of it sharp and chemical and wrong for a moment, then right. Her own hands looked like someone else's hands, steady as a surgeon's laser, fingers spreading to locate the ribs, finding the space between the 5th and 6th rib at the midclavicular line, the exact spot where she had done this in a combat surgical hospital with nothing but a headlamp and the sound of outgoing mortar fire. The needle was 18 gauge, long enough to reach through skin and muscle and the fibrous pericardial sac. She advanced it with millimeter precision, feeling for the distinctive pop, the give that meant she had penetrated the pericardium. There. The needle went through, and she threaded the catheter over it, removing the needle with a quick, practiced movement. The syringe went on next, and she pulled. The fluid came back dark and thick with blood, 120 cubic centimeters of it drawn into the barrel, each cc released from around the Admiral's heart, giving it another millimeter of space to beat, another fraction of pressure to generate. His BP rose to 48/28. Then 52/34. The pressure climbed with each withdrawal of fluid, as if the numbers were climbing out of a grave hand over hand. 61/38. 74/42. She drew off the last 20 ccs and disposed of the syringe, securing the catheter with tape, her movements clinical and unremarkable, as though she had just changed a dressing instead of performed emergency surgery in an ICU without an attending present. The monitor's alarm pitch changed. The heart rhythm stabilized. The wild thrashing became a steady, recognizable pattern. Sinus rhythm. The kind that meant the bird could breathe again. She was documenting the vitals in the chart when she heard the elevator doors open. Dr. Whitfield emerged from the stairwell 2 minutes later, still in street clothes, his hair disheveled, his face carrying the particular irritation of a man whose sleep had been interrupted by a page. His eyes moved across the ICU in that scanning pattern doctors use, assessing, dismissing, cataloguing inefficiency. Then they landed on Bay 7. On the pericardiocentesis kit. On Hannah standing beside the Admiral's bed, chart in hand. His face went through a color change like a sunset in reverse, red fading to white, white hardening back to red. She watched it happen. Watched him understand that something had been done. Something definitive. Something that worked. "What did you do?" His voice came out clipped, small, a man whose question was already a diagnosis of his own failure. Hannah handed him the chart. No preamble. No explanation. No defensiveness. Just the documentation, clean and precise and irrefutable. The refusals from 20 different doctors were all logged there, each name timestamped. The procedure note was in her handwriting, the vitals were climbing in trajectory from 38/22 to the current 89/51, and the Admiral's monitor was displaying a rhythm that was not only salvageable but improving. Dr. Whitfield read it. She watched his hands begin to tremble, not the trembling of fear, but the kind that comes from rage being compressed into muscles that have nowhere to direct it. She had seen that trembling before. In men who had just realized they were outmaneuvered. In men who had just understood that the hierarchy they believed in was paper thin. He was still holding the chart when he pulled out his phone. She watched him do it. Watched him dial with his thumb moving like a man operating a detonator. "This is Dr. Marcus Whitfield. I need to report a critical incident at St. Michael's. A non-physician staff member just performed an emergency pericardiocentesis without authorization." He paused. "No, the patient is stable now. That's the problem. She violated scope of practice, she performed a procedure without attending authorization, and I need this documented." Another pause. His eyes found Hannah. "Yes. I'll hold." The next call came before the first one ended. He spoke to the chief of surgery, then to the hospital president, then to his lawyer cousin. By the time the fourth call connected to the board member from his Thursday golf game, Hannah had already returned to the Admiral's bedside and was checking the catheter placement, ensuring the fluid that had been choking his heart had truly drained, reading the arterial line and seeing the numbers stable and climbing like a chart of redemption nobody had authorized. Security arrived at 0247. 2 officers she recognized from the lobby, men who had never had cause to interact with her before because she was the quiet nurse, the one who never caused trouble, the one you overlooked in a hallway full of doctors. They didn't meet her eyes as they walked her through the ICU toward administration. The other nurses watched. She kept her jaw level. Kept her breathing steady. Kept her composure like a shield held together by nothing but will. The suspension paperwork was already drawn up. Dr. Whitfield's lawyer cousin had worked fast, filing a formal complaint alleging practicing beyond scope of practice, unauthorized procedure, patient endangerment, and breach of medical delegation protocols. By 0400, her badge was deactivated. By 04:30, her locker had been emptied by a hospital administrator and a security officer, the contents placed in a cardboard box while she stood there watching. Her scrubs, her stethoscope, her personal items folded and removed with the efficiency of an eviction. The challenge coin was at the bottom, still wrapped in the surgical glove she had hidden it in months ago. She picked it up. The metal had warmed from her hand, and when she closed her fingers around it, it left an imprint in her palm, the raised edges of the insignia marking her skin like a brand, like proof that something real had existed before she became this version of herself. She drove to the parking lot and sat in her car as the sky began its transformation from black to grey. The sun didn't rise so much as leak through the clouds, a cold and distant thing that seemed to be illuminating a world she was no longer part of. Her phone showed no messages. No calls from colleagues. No one from the hospital had her personal number, and if they did, they wouldn't be calling to offer support. She held the challenge coin and thought about the Admiral, about whether he would survive the next 12 hours, about whether anyone would ever tell him what had happened at 0200, about whether he would ever understand who it was who had given him back his heart. She drove to an all-night diner on 82nd Avenue as the sun was finishing its rise, her hand still steady on the wheel, her composure still intact, her jaw clenched so hard that her teeth ached. The waitress was older, maybe 60, with the kind of weathered competence that comes from working graveyard shifts for decades. She poured coffee without asking. Hannah wrapped her hands around the cup and didn't drink it. The coffee went cold while she sat there, staring at her own reflection in the window, a ghost of a woman in scrubs that were no longer hers, holding a coin from a life that the Navy had ordered her to forget, and wondering if disappearing was always supposed to feel this close to dying. Dr. Whitfield arrived at 0210 hours, 10 minutes after Hannah's hands had stopped shaking. He moved through the ICU like a man checking his investment portfolio, white coat crisp as fresh currency, loafers clicking against tile with the rhythm of someone accustomed to being heard. The Admiral's monitor beeped its steady rhythm, sinus, stable, alive, but Whitfield's jaw tightened seeing it. He pulled out his phone before he even reached the nursing station. The first call went to the hospital president at home. Hannah watched from across the unit, her hand still moving through documentation, her face a mask that revealed nothing. Whitfield's voice carried that particular pitch of controlled fury, the sound a man makes when his narrative has been disrupted. We have a protocol violation. Catastrophic scope creep. A nurse performing an invasive procedure without physician authorization. Pause. Hannah didn't look up. Yes. The Admiral. She's destabilized the liability profile. We need suspension, investigation, and documentation. The phone lowered. He was already dialing again. Chief of Surgery answered on the second ring. Whitfield repeated the performance, same words, same theatrical concern, but this time with additional flourishes about patient endangerment and institutional exposure. The words landed like accusations with teeth. Hannah turned a page in her notes. The pen didn't waver. By the time Whitfield hung up, he'd already moved to the third call, this one to a board member named Garrison, someone Whitfield mentioned golfing with every third week, someone who counted on Whitfield's referrals for orthopedic cases that paid 6 figures annually. Marcus. It's David. We've got an incident. Not a question. Not an emergency. An incident. A problem requiring the right people's attention. I'm looking at a suspension package now. Won't take long once legal reviews it. You'll want the board to know before it goes public. Protects the hospital. By 02:45 hours, it was done. A suspension notice appeared in the system, effective immediately, pending investigation into an authorized medical intervention. Hannah's badge was already deactivated by the time she finished her shift report. She knew before anyone told her. The access reader at the locker room door rejected her 3 times before she understood that the system no longer recognized her as real. The security escort arrived at dawn, not hostile, just present. A routine procedure. Locker contents inventoried by a hospital administrator reading from a checklist while Hannah stood silent, watching someone else's hands move through the items that comprised her shift identity. Extra stethoscope. Compression socks. A photo she'd forgotten was there, her and the Admiral, before the stroke, before memory dissolved, from a rare moment when he'd been lucid enough to smile at the nurse with his name tattooed on her arm. She didn't reach for it. Whitfield's lawyer cousin filed the complaint before sunrise, a formal written statement alleging that Hannah Clarke, licensed practical nurse, had performed pericardiocentesis, a procedure explicitly reserved for licensed physicians, without physician supervision, authorization, or standing orders. The complaint was meticulous, legalistic, devastating. It cited the Nursing Board's scope of practice regulations verbatim. It suggested criminal negligence. It recommended permanent license revocation and civil penalties. All true. All technically true. 20 doctors had refused. 1 nurse had not. That distinction would matter in a courtroom, but not in a personnel file. By 0600 hours, Hannah Clarke no longer worked at St. Michael's. By 0630 hours, her clearance had expired. By 0700 hours, she was someone else again, not a nurse, not a master chief, not even a person the hospital's systems would acknowledge. She was a liability wearing scrubs that no longer belonged to her, carrying a cardboard box of personal effects that fit in the crook of one arm. The diner on 82nd Avenue stayed open 24 hours, which meant it stayed open for people who had nowhere else to go at 3 in the morning. Hannah sat in a booth by the window, the vinyl seat cracked and taped, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had gone cold somewhere between the first hour of staring and the second. The coffee inside had developed a skin, that film of separation that forms when heat abandons liquid and time moves forward without purpose. Outside, Portland slept. Rain fell in that particular Pacific Northwest way, not dramatic, not violent, just perpetual, as if the sky had decided to weep indefinitely and had made peace with the commitment. Yellow streetlights reflected off wet asphalt. A few cars passed. A delivery truck rumbled toward the industrial warehouse district. Nothing moved with urgency. Nothing moved like it mattered. Hannah stared at her reflection in the window glass. The woman looking back was a ghost, hollow-eyed, stripped down, wearing the ruins of a shift that had ended 6 hours ago but felt like 6 months. Her scrubs were still damp from the Admiral's blood, from the fluid she'd drawn from his pericardium, from the life she'd pulled back from the edge of nothing. The hospital had provided scrubs before escorting her out. She'd changed in the locker room while someone watched from the doorway, neither of them speaking, both of them understanding that silence was the only appropriate soundtrack for erasure. The waitress approached with the coffee pot, steam rising like a ghost of its own, and asked if Hannah wanted a refill. Hannah didn't answer. The waitress waited, professional patience, the kind developed through years of serving people who were using the diner as a waiting room for decisions they hadn't yet made. "Honey, you want anything else?" Nothing else came. Hannah still didn't answer. The waitress set the pot down and walked away, leaving Hannah alone with the ghost face in the window and the weight of the thing she was gripping in her right fist. The challenge coin was tarnished silver, inscribed with a designation that officially never existed: Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, JSOC Task Force, Helm and Province 2017. On the reverse side was a single word: Phantom. The Navy had ordered her to destroy it, destroy all of it, destroy the proof that Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke had ever been real. Delete the database entries. Burn the photographs. Forget the operation in Sanjin Valley where she'd carried a wounded Admiral 3 miles through active enemy fire, where she'd performed field surgery in the dark with a trauma shears and a field bandage, where she'd breathed life back into him twice because the alternative was leaving him there in the dust while she survived and he didn't. The Navy had given her a new identity instead: civilian. Nurse. Invisible. Harmless. Just a woman in scrubs, unremarkable, forgettable, someone who could move through the world without triggering the national security protocols that protected classified operations and decorated combat medics who'd been ordered to vanish. She'd worn the coin in a surgical glove inside her locker for 7 years. Insurance. Proof. A talisman against the dissolution she'd been promised. And someone had found it. Someone had seen the name and the rank and the designation and had chosen, for reasons that didn't matter anymore, to leave it there instead of reporting it. The hospital's security footage would show her sitting in the break room at 18:47 hours on her final evening, her hand shaking as she opened her locker, as she discovered the coin was exactly where she'd left it. Safe. Still hidden. Still real. Except now she wasn't. Hannah gripped the coin so hard the metal edges cut crescents into her palm, small curved impressions that would bruise by morning. Pain was information. Pain meant the coin was solid. Pain meant she was solid. Pain meant something was still real in a world that had decided to erase her twice, first by the military after the operation that never happened, now by a hospital that treated her like a liability for saving an admiral's life. She stared at the ghost woman in the window, the one wearing stolen scrubs and holding a coin she wasn't supposed to own, and wondered if this was what disappearing was supposed to feel like. Not violent. Not sudden. Just slow, like cold coffee, like lights going out one room at a time, like a person gradually recognizing their own reflection less and less with each passing moment. The diner's television mounted above the counter showed the time, 3:14 a.m. The date on the news crawl read March 14, 2024. Somewhere in that margin of numbers and nothing, Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke was supposed to still exist. Somewhere in the military's classified databases, in the redacted files at JSOC headquarters in North Carolina, in the memory of 20 doctors who'd walked away from the Admiral's bed and left her alone to decide if one more act of heroism might be the final thing that destroyed her, somewhere, she was still real. She set the coin on the table between the cold coffee and the salt shaker. The insignia caught the diner's fluorescent light, that sickly yellow glow that made everything look like it was already decaying. She studied the emblem as if she'd never seen it before. As if it belonged to someone else entirely. The waitress returned, filled the coffee mug with fresh brew, and left without comment. Hannah didn't touch it. She just sat there, watching the steam rise from the cup, watching it dissipate into nothing, watching the space where something had been become empty again. Outside, the rain continued. Perpetual. Indifferent. The way it always was. The evening news bloomed across the hospital lobby television at full volume, and Hannah Clarke was finishing a cup of coffee in the cafeteria 2 floors below when the broadcast changed everything. A veterans advocacy group had released a photograph, grainy, official, a Navy headshot from 18 years ago, of a missing decorated combat medic. Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke. Navy Cross recipient. Last seen in Helmand Province. The photo showed a younger version of her face, eyes forward, uniform immaculate, but unmistakably hers. The caption crawled across the bottom in white letters, missing since 2006. Do you know this hero? Hannah's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they were deliberating her next move. By the time she climbed the stairs to the lobby, a crowd had formed in front of the television screen. At least 15 people, maybe more, all staring at the image being repeated on loop with the advocacy group's hotline number below it. A young corpsman working rehab, maybe 24, dark hair, the kind of posture that came from basic training, was the first to breathe the name out loud. Not Hannah. Not the name on her ID badge. The other name. The one that belonged to classified operations and redacted files and a life the Navy had ordered erased. Phantom, the corpsman whispered, and Hannah felt the word hit her like a defibrillator pad, sudden, electric, impossible to ignore. The security guard near the main entrance was a veteran too. Hannah recognized him from the way he held himself, the way his eyes tracked threats, the way his hand rested near his hip like muscle memory. He saw the photo at the same moment the corpsman spoke the code name. His entire body straightened. His jaw locked. And then he announced it to the gathering crowd with the precision of a drill sergeant calling roll at formation, Master Chief on deck. Nobody moved. Hannah stood at the edge of the crowd, still holding her coffee cup, watching a room full of people slowly turn to understand what they were actually looking at. The security guard's eyes found hers across the lobby. Recognition flashed through them like a circuit closing. He nodded once, a small, deep gesture of respect that carried 18 years of classified operations in a single dip of his chin. The corpsman turned around looking for the source of that command voice. Saw her. blinked twice like he was running facial recognition software in his own head. Then his shoulders dropped, and he moved out of the way without being asked, the kind of automatic deference that came from understanding rank in your bones. Hannah set her coffee cup on a nearby chair and waited, because waiting was all she could do. A 2-star general was visiting his mother in the cardiac ward on the 4th floor when the news broke. His aide showed him the broadcast on her phone at 18:47 hours. The general, brigadier rank, service record spanning 32 years, set down his briefing folder, stood up from his mother's bedside, and marched directly to the hospital administrator's office without an appointment. He didn't knock. He walked through the door like it was a tactical entry point, and his presence made the air pressure change, made the administrative staff stop typing mid-sentence. "I need Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke's full service record. Now. And I need to know why a decorated naval officer is working in your ICU without protection or recognition." The general's voice was steady as a laser sight. "You have 3 minutes before I call NCIS." The administrator's face went pale, the color of old bone. Within an hour, the Admiral was wheeled down to the lobby in his hospital bed, still hooked to monitors and 4 lines, his mobility fragile but his mind, his memory, returning in waves. He saw the photograph on the television screen and understood something that made him weep. His hand, shaking from the stroke but determined, lifted to the faded tattoo on his forearm. The one that read Clarke. He looked at the crowd surrounding him and then at Hannah, standing quietly at the perimeter, and he began to speak in the voice of a man who had been given back his own story. "That woman," he said, pointing at the screen and then at Hannah with the same trembling arm, "carried me for 3 miles through enemy fire in Helmand Province. 3 miles. While taking rounds. While dragging 220 pounds of Admiral through sand and bullets and screaming." His voice cracked like old ice breaking. "She breathed life back into me twice. Once in the province. Once in that ICU upstairs when 20 doctors said I was finished. 20 doctors gave up. She didn't." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilators in the distance, their mechanical whisper like 1,000 secrets finally being told. The Admiral's eyes locked onto Hannah's across the lobby, and recognition moved through them, real recognition, his memory restored, his gratitude made whole. "Master Chief," he said, using her rank for the first time in 18 years, "you saved me twice. And I'm alive because you refused to stop when everyone else did." Hannah's composure didn't crack. It never did. But her hand moved to her side, and for a moment, her fingers curled into a fist, then opened again. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, 18 years of it, finally meeting something real. Dr. Whitfield was in his office when his phone rang at 19:23 hours. The call came through his personal line, the one his medical school mentor had. The man who had championed his career 23 years ago. The man who had written his fellowship recommendations. The man Whitfield had been trying to impress his entire professional life. The mentor had watched the hallway security footage go viral. 2,300,000 views in 4 hours. The video showed Whitfield mocking a Navy Cross recipient in slow motion. Dollar store nurse. Community college credentials. "Do you need help with the vending machine?" The comment section was a massacre, military veterans, healthcare workers, and angry citizens all identifying the same pattern, a man using institutional power to crush someone he didn't understand, someone who'd actually saved lives while he collected kickbacks. The mentor's voice came through the phone like a scalpel. Cold. Surgical. Each word a separate incision. "You are no student of mine. I will personally recommend your immediate termination to the hospital board. Do not contact me again." The line went dead. Whitfield's hand started to shake. Within 90 minutes, the hospital board convened emergency session. The administrator presented a timeline, the 20 documented refusals to treat the Admiral, Hannah's successful pericardiocentesis, the patient's full recovery, the equipment orders under Whitfield's signature, invoices inflated by 340%, paid to his brother's medical supply company, the kickback structure Hannah had started questioning 3 weeks prior. The board reviewed the viral video. They reviewed Dr. Whitfield's employment contract and the termination clause for gross professional misconduct. His golf partners weren't returning calls. His lawyer cousin withdrew representation at 2011 hours, citing conflict of interest. The board voted unanimously at 2,247 hours. By midnight, Whitfield's office had been cleared by security. His badge was deactivated. He was escorted out through the same automatic doors Hannah had walked through 48 hours earlier. News cameras caught him in the parking lot, his jacket over his head, no comment, moving like a man whose world had inverted in 4 hours. The hospital's official statement came through at 0304 hours. Dr. Marcus Whitfield's employment has been terminated effective immediately. An investigation into potential financial irregularities is ongoing in cooperation with federal authorities. In his car in the parking lot, Whitfield sat alone with his phone full of blocked numbers and watched St. Michael's shrink in his rearview mirror. 6 months later, Hannah Clarke stood at attention in full dress blues inside a Pentagon ceremony room. The uniform was fitted perfectly. The Navy Cross was already pinned to her chest, the one she'd earned 18 years ago in Helmand Province, the one that had been classified and sealed and erased from every official record until 36 hours ago. Now the Secretary of the Navy was standing in front of her with a second citation in his hands. The Admiral sat in his wheelchair beside her, his recovery complete, his hand resting on her forearm with the grip of a man who understood what she'd sacrificed. The corpsman who'd recognized her code name was in the audience. The 2-star general was in the front row. The new chief of staff at St. Michael's stood in the back, witnessing what was being corrected today. The Secretary of the Navy spoke directly to Hannah, his voice carrying the weight of institutional recognition finally arriving where it should have been decades earlier. Master Chief Petty Officer Clarke, you demonstrated extraordinary heroism not just in combat operations, but in upholding the code that defines our service, never leaving your people behind. Even when 20 doctors refused to act. Even when institutional power stood against you. Even when the world had tried to erase you. He looked down at the citation. Today, we acknowledge that you never stopped. You never accepted the refusal. You never broke. And that's why we're here. The pin went through the uniform with the sound of something finally clicking into place. Hannah's composure held. Her eyes forward. But her hand tightened on the Admiral's, and everyone in the room understood what that gesture meant. 18 years of silence, finally answered. The reception afterward filled a ballroom with military personnel, hospital administrators, and veterans advocates. The young corpsman who'd recognized her code name approached Hannah while she stood near the window, watching rain streak the glass. He asked if the stories about Phantom were true. Hannah's face remained composed, but there was something different in her now, a presence that made the air pressure change around her, something that came from being fully seen, finally, after 18 years of hiding in plain sight. Most of them, she said quietly. The ones that matter are. The Admiral wheeled himself over, his hand reaching for hers, and his eyes were clear now, fully present, fully remembering. They stood together watching the rain, and no one interrupted them, because some recognitions don't need witnesses. Back at St. Michael's, 3 weeks after the ceremony, Hannah was reinstated. Not just reinstated, promoted to ICU Clinical Director. The position came with office space and the authority to design new protocols. She passed the break room where Dr. Whitfield had mocked her, where she'd stood in silence and let his words fall away like rain, and continued to her office. The tarnished challenge coin sat on her desk now, no longer hidden inside a surgical glove. It caught the afternoon light, silver and scarred and finally allowed to exist openly. The board had commissioned an investigation into every case Whitfield had overseen in the past 5 years. 3 patients showed signs of delayed treatment decisions that benefited his brother's supply company. The federal investigation into financial irregularities was ongoing. His medical license was under review. His brother's supply company was being audited by the Department of Defense. As for Whitfield himself, news came through that he was teaching CPR fundamentals at a community college in Eugene for $18 an hour. His hands shook when he demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy. His voice had lost its authority. The students, mostly high school kids working toward their certification, didn't know who he'd been, didn't understand what he'd lost. They just saw an older man demonstrating life-saving techniques to people who would probably never remember his name. Hannah sat at her desk, reviewing ICU protocols with the kind of focus that had always been her strongest weapon. The challenge coin caught the light again. In 6 months, she had been erased, nearly destroyed, then restored to a rank that had been stolen from her. The quietest person in the room had been holding it all together the whole time, not just the Admiral's life, not just the hospital's integrity, but her own truth. If you've been underestimated by someone in power, if you've watched institutional corruption and wondered if speaking up would cost everything, comment below. Tell me your story. And please, subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, about corruption being exposed, about the people who save lives when the system says to let go.